March the 20th, 1974. 7:50 in the evening. The Mall, London. 200 yards from the gates of Buckingham Palace, a maroon limousine carrying the Queen's only daughter is forced to a stop by a white Ford Escort. A man steps out holding 2 pistols. He fires through the windshield. He walks to the rear door. He opens it. He looks at a 23-year-old princess sitting alone in the back of a stopped car, points a loaded gun directly at her, and tells her she is coming with him. And she looks straight back at him. No screaming, no begging, no theatrics. And she says 3 words. 3 words that will go down as one of the most remarkable sentences ever spoken by a member of the British royal family. And what happened in the next 47 seconds would expose, permanently and irrevocably, just how catastrophically unprepared the monarchy actually was. If you are new here, this channel exists because the official version is never the full version. Hit like, hit subscribe, and stay with me, because this one goes places the palace would very much prefer it didn't. Right, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened on the Mall that evening, you need to understand exactly who was in that car and exactly who was walking toward it. Princess Anne in 1974 was not yet the Princess Royal. She was not yet the iron-willed, no-nonsense, harder-working than anyone institution she would eventually become. She was 23 years old. She was the second child of Queen Elizabeth II, the only daughter, and she had been married for exactly 4 months to Captain Mark Phillips, a Westminster Abbey wedding in November 1973 that had been watched by 500 million people around the world. 500 million. That number matters because it tells you exactly how visible she was, exactly how known her face was, and exactly how attractive a target she represented. That evening, she had been to a charity film screening. The Riding for the Disabled Association, at BAFTA headquarters on Piccadilly. She was being driven home in a standard royal limousine, a maroon Austin princess, with her husband beside her, her personal protection officer, her chauffeur, and her lady-in-waiting. She had no reason to expect anything but an ordinary journey back to the palace. 200 yards. She was 200 yards from the gate when a white Ford Escort came from nowhere and cut directly across the front of the car, forcing it to stop. Now, let's talk about the man who got out of that Escort. Because Ian Bull is one of the most meticulously prepared and simultaneously catastrophically unsuccessful criminals in the history of British law. He was 26 years old, unemployed, from North London. Scotland Yard, in their initial investigation, checked for IRA links immediately. This was 1974. The Troubles were active, and a targeted attack on a royal would have been exactly the kind of escalation the Irish Republican paramilitaries had been threatening. But Bull had no political affiliations. None. He was not an ideological actor. He was a man with undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia who had, over the course of several months, constructed what he believed was an airtight plan to kidnap a princess. And I want you to understand how much preparation went into this, because it matters. Bull had rented a house in Hampshire, on a dead-end road 5 miles from Sandhurst, which was where Anne and her husband actually lived. He had a typewriter, which police later traced directly to him, on which he had typed a ransom letter demanding £2 million from the Queen. The letter contained the line, and I am reading from the documented court record here, "Anne will be shot dead." He had £300 in cash on him, in £10 notes, for expenses. He had researched the target. He had been phoning the Buckingham Palace press office, the actual press office, and asking when Princess Anne would next be appearing in public. And they told him. Because in 1974, nobody had designed a system to stop that kind of inquiry. He simply rang up, asked when the princess was out, and they answered. The plan was theoretically simple. Round the limousine, force Anne into his car, drive to the Hampshire house, demand the ransom, fund, and this is the part that still startles people, fund mental health treatment for himself through the National Health Service. That was the stated motive. He wanted £2 million from the Queen of England so that he could receive NHS psychiatric care. A man who needed psychiatric care so badly that he kidnapped a princess to pay for it, while simultaneously demonstrating, through the act of attempting to kidnap a princess, that he needed psychiatric care. The plan began falling apart the moment it started. Ball's first action was to fire through the windshield of the limousine. This hit Brian Mitchell, the chauffeur, in the hand. His second target was the most critical one, Inspector James Beaton. I am 30 years old. Anne's personal protection officer, assigned through SO14, the Royalty Protection Branch of Scotland Yard. Beaton was between 3 and 5 feet from Ball when the shooting started. He drew his Walther PPK service pistol and fired back. 1 round. And then the gun jammed. The Walther PPK jammed on the return shot, leaving Beaton standing in the middle of the mall with an armed and agitated man in front of him and a useless weapon in his hand. What happened next is why James Beaton was awarded the George Cross, the highest civilian gallantry medal in the British honours system. Higher than the MBE, higher than the OBE, behind only the Victoria Cross among awards for courage. Ball shot Beaton. Beaton kept moving toward him. Ball shot Beaton again. Beaton kept moving. Ball shot Beaton a third time. James Beaton, shot 3 times, kept physically placing himself between Ian Ball and Princess Anne. The citation in the London Gazette describes his conduct as outstandingly brave. That is an understatement of almost comic proportions. Ball eventually got past Beaton and moved to the rear door of the limousine. He opened it. And here is where we get to the sentence, the 3 words. Because what happened next is documented not through hearsay, not through palace PR, not through the kind of curated royal mythology that gets built up around these moments over decades. It is documented in Princess Anne's own words from her 1980 interview with Michael Parkinson on BBC television, given 6 years after the event, when she had had time to reflect and was speaking with the kind of composure that only comes from having genuinely processed something, rather than performing processing it. Ball pointed a pistol at her and told her she had to come with him. She said, "Not bloody likely." And then, and this is the part that tends to get left out of the short version, she engaged him in conversation. Her own account describes a negotiation that lasted several minutes. All kept insisting. She kept, in her words, explaining that it would be much better if he simply moved away and they all forgot about it. She also, at one point, considered punching him. She considered the geometry of it, the angle, the distance, whether she could land something meaningful, and decided against it. Not out of fear, out of tactical assessment. She decided it was not the right move at that moment. I am 23 years old, in the back of a stopped car, 3 gunshots already fired outside. Her protection officer was bleeding on the road, and she is doing a tactical assessment of whether she can successfully punch the man holding a gun at her. The palace has always presented this as a charming royal pluck. What it actually represents is something more instructive than that. It represents the gap between what the monarchy projected to the public, serene, protected, untouchable, and what it actually was on the night of the 20th of March, 1974. A young woman, alone in the back of a car, talking down a gunman because there was nothing else between her and him. But then, and this is what makes this story genuinely extraordinary rather than merely dramatic, the people of London refused to walk past. Ronnie Russell was a former boxer. He was on the Mall that evening, saw what he initially assumed was a road rage incident, and then saw Inspector Beaton bleeding. Russell walked up behind Ian Ball and punched him in the back of the head. He then helped pull Princess Anne toward the other side of the car, putting the vehicle between her and the gunman. Brian McConnell was a journalist. He worked for the Daily Mirror. He was passing by, saw the situation unfolding, and did something that, if you described it to someone before it happened, they would tell you was absolute madness. He walked toward the man with the guns, hands up, open, and he said, "Don't be silly, son, just give me the gun." Ball shot him in the chest. Police Constable Michael Hills was a uniformed police officer on patrol in the area. He ran toward the gunfire. Ball shot him in the stomach. Glenmore Martin, a chauffeur for a car nearby, used his vehicle to block Ball's escape route. And then, within 4 minutes of the attack beginning, an off-duty detective constable named Peter Edmonds arrived on the scene, threw his coat over Bull's head, took him down, and arrested him. All was dragged into St. James's Park. Princess Anne was unhurt. 4 other human beings had been shot. 4 people. Shot on the ceremonial road that runs from Trafalgar Square to Buckingham Palace. On a Wednesday evening. At 10 minutes to 8 at night. Now, the trial. Because the legal record is where the full picture of what Bull had constructed becomes visible. He was charged at the Old Bailey with attempted murder, attempted kidnapping, and grievous bodily harm. He pleaded guilty to all of it. Psychiatric assessment confirmed what his entire plan had already implied. Paranoid schizophrenia. Undiagnosed at the time of the attack. He was sentenced under the Mental Health Act and committed indefinitely to Broadmoor Hospital, Britain's highest security psychiatric facility. He would remain there, and later at Rampton, for 45 years. He was released in 2019. But here is what the legal record also established. The Bull had everything in place. The house, the ransom letter, the cash, the typewriter, the practiced approach. He had studied her schedule through legitimate public channels because the palace had no mechanism to prevent it. He had a backup plan. What he did not have, what his entire schema could not account for, was the response of ordinary Londoners who saw something wrong and simply refused to look the other way. A boxer, a journalist, a constable, a chauffeur, a detective in plain clothes with a coat. None of them were supposed to be there. None of them were part of any security protocol. They were just people who were on the Mall that night, and who looked at the man with a gun and decided, independently and without coordination, that they were going to do something about it. The institution, which was supposed to protect her, had given her one armed officer with a pistol that jammed. The public, which had no formal role in her protection whatsoever, gave her 5 people who walked toward gunfire. That asymmetry is the real story of the 20th of March 1974. And the palace knew it. Because after that night, everything changed. The security protocols that govern the British royal family today, armoured vehicles, multiple armed protection officers, varied and unpredictable routes, enhanced intelligence on persons of interest, restricted public disclosure of royal schedules. Every single one of those protocols has a direct line back to the 47 seconds Ian Bull spent on the Mall. Before that night, Princess Anne was driven in a standard limousine with 1 armed bodyguard. 1. After that night, never again. The gaps that Bull had identified and exploited were closed, systematically and permanently, because the alternative was too visible, too documented, and too embarrassing for any institution that presented itself as competent to contemplate. There is an irony to it that the palace has never fully acknowledged. The security overhaul happened not because of effective risk management, but because the failure was so total and so public that it left no other option. Beaton's bravery, the civilian interventions, Anne's own composure, all of it obscured in the immediate media coverage and in the decades of retrospective telling, how completely the protective system had failed at its most basic function. The princess survived because of a boxer's fists, a journalist's nerve, and her own refusal to cooperate. Not because of anything the institution had designed. Inspector Beaton survived his 3 gunshot wounds. He was awarded the George Cross at an investiture at Buckingham Palace. He lived until 2020. P.C. Hills survived. Brian McConnell, the man who walked toward a gun with his hands empty and his voice steady, lived until 2004. Ronnie Russell, the former boxer, received the George Medal from the Queen, and reportedly, because this comes from accounts of the investiture rather than an official transcript, the Queen told him, "The medal is from the Queen of England. The thank you is from Anne's mother." I want to sit with that for a moment. Because there is the institution, and there is the woman inside the institution. And in that sentence, if it was said, and the account is consistent across multiple sources, Elizabeth Windsor stepped out from behind Elizabeth Regina for just a moment and acknowledged that what she felt was not a sovereign's gratitude for protection of a state asset. It was a mother's gratitude for the protection of her daughter, who had been, for several terrifying minutes on a Wednesday evening in spring, sitting in a stopped car, talking to a man with a gun, because there was nothing else between them. Now, we need to talk about 2025, because Ian Ball, released from Broadmoor in 2019 after 45 years, did not quietly disappear into whatever life looks like after 4.5 decades in a high-security psychiatric facility. In March 2025, he made a public statement, reported in March 2026 by international press, including the Athens Times. And the statement was this: the entire 1974 incident was a staged hoax, orchestrated, he claimed, by Queen Elizabeth II herself, with him as a knowing, consenting participant. I'm going to be precise about how I handle this, because this channel is about evidence and record, not about sensation. The claim is false. It is false in every documentable particular. The men who were shot were genuinely shot. Their wounds are in the medical record. Beaton's 3 gunshot wounds are in his George Cross citation in the London Gazette. Brian McConnell's chest wound is in contemporaneous hospital records. PC Hill's stomach wound was severe enough to require significant medical treatment. These are not things you stage for a hoax in 1974 London, on a public road with multiple independent civilian witnesses who had no connection to the palace or to each other. But Ball's statement is still part of the documentary record now. And the honest, accurate, non-sensationalized framing of it is this: it is entirely consistent with the paranoid schizophrenia that has defined the second half of his life. The mind that constructed a £2 million kidnapping plan and believed it was rational has now, 50 years later, constructed a narrative in which he was not the perpetrator, but the participant in a grand deception. It is not sinister. It is not a conspiracy. It is a 76-year-old man with a serious mental illness, whose relationship with reality has always been complicated, and who has spent 45 years in institutions processing an act that changed his life as completely as it changed hers. The 5 bullet wounds in 5 other people are the answer to his claim. That is the end of it. What I want to close on is this, because there is a version of this story that has been told for 50 years, and it goes roughly like this: brave princess, famous quip, good outcome, security upgraded, lesson learned, moving on. And that version is not wrong, exactly, but it is radically incomplete in a way that serves the institution and obscures the reality. The reality is that on the 20th of March 1974, the British monarchy's protective apparatus, the official, formal, designed system, was reduced, within seconds, to a single officer with a jammed gun. Everything else was improvised. Everything else was civilian. Everything else was human beings making individual decisions to walk toward danger rather than away from it, with no training, no authority, no equipment, and no guarantee of anything except that something was wrong, and they were there. Princess Anne, who became Princess Royal in 1987, has gone on to complete more royal engagements per year than any other working royal. Over 470 in 2024 alone. She is routinely described as the hardest working member of the modern monarchy, and the least likely to make a fuss about it. Her stoicism is institutional legend. But that stoicism did not appear from nowhere in middle age. It was visible at 23, on the evening of the 20th of March 1974, in the back of a stopped car 200 yards from home, doing a tactical assessment of whether she could punch a man while simultaneously maintaining a conversation with him to buy time. The word brave gets used about royals quite casually. It gets attached to public speeches about difficult subjects, to walkabouts in complicated neighborhoods, to the simple act of maintaining composure under flashbulbs. Those things require something, but they are not what happened on the Mall. What happened on the Mall was a 23-year-old woman, alone, with no working protection, who looked at a man with a loaded gun and decided, in real time, that she was not going to give him what he wanted, and that she was going to stay calm and talk and wait and hold the space until something changed. And she was right. And it worked. And 4 other people paid in blood for the gap between what the institution promised and what it actually delivered.
3 words. In the back of a stopped car, on a March evening in 1974.
And the institution learned, in those 47 seconds, exactly how vulnerable it had always been, and how little of that vulnerability it had ever been honest about. That is the story the palace would prefer you summarize as a charming royal anecdote. It is not a charming royal anecdote. It is a forensic record of institutional failure, civilian courage, and one young woman's absolute refusal to be moved. And 50 years on, it deserves to be told in full. If this is the kind of history you are here for, the version without the gloss, without the PR, without the curated mythology, then you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.